When Sarkis Parajanyan, the already famous Soviet director, got a flat in Kiev, Ukraine, he turned it into something between a box of candies and a museum. On a prominent place one could find an extremely complimentary letter from Federico Fellini, put into a golden frame, adorned by a feather of a peacock, and dried forget-me-nots. The letter begins with the words, "My dear Serge." Next to it there is a letter from Andrzej Wajda, who refers to Parajanov as "my venerable colleague and teacher." A carriage lantern glows at the head of the bed. On the ceiling there is an elegant gilded chair hanging upside down so that everyone can read on it the words from the collection of His Imperial Majesty. This is just one of the many descriptions surrounding the person who is perhaps one of the most important directors in world cinema, that is Sergei Parajanov, also known as Sergei Parajanov in Ukrainian and Sarkis Parajanyan in his mother tongue Armenian. Beginning to speak about his work is impossible without first speaking about his life. And I could begin like this. He was born in Tbilisi, Georgia in 1924 to a family of Armenians. In 1946 he enrolled in the Institute of Cinematography. In 1952 he moved to Kiev. In 1965 he became an acclaimed director, etc., etc. But that in fact would tell you absolutely nothing about Parajanov, because his life cannot really fit into a chronological sequence of events or any kind of systematic biography. Much of his life is about things that easily slip out of biographies. These are stories, anecdotes, memories, descriptions, pictures, etc. As Ivan Dzюба, a Ukrainian critic and a close friend of Parajanov, wrote about him, if you could film the days of his life with a hidden camera, this would perhaps be Parajanov's most fantastic work of art. But because such a film was never made, the most appropriate way to get to know Parajanov seems to be through a collection of stories and pictures of this incredible artist. The first thing that most of the people who write memoirs about Parajanov note is his extreme aestheticism, his love for beautiful things and clothes, which undoubtedly is also reflected in his movies. He was worried about every piece of beauty in this world. In one of the interviews, Dzюба was writing about Parajanov that Sergei was thinking in paintings and colors. He perceived the world through aesthetics. His flat was once brutally searched by the police, but what he remembered the most from that day was an old doll that fell to the ground and got a crack on its head. That was what worried him the most. Another important aspect of Parajanov is that he was not of the learned kind of artists, the ones who have read a huge number of books and from that drew some extremely complicated conceptuality. Nothing like that. However, he did have a library, and he was very proud of it. It consisted of 2 books, The Russian Tale Moidadir and The Centaur by John Updike, a gift from the author. And despite that, Parajanov always seemed to be very well acquainted with a whole lot of things. To quote Dzюба once again, it seemed like he never read anything at all, but nonetheless knew everything and could always give an unmistakable account of all kinds of literary, artistic, cultural and political events and processes. What probably helped a lot was his intuition of a genius. It was enough for him to cast an eye over something, hear a passage, flip through a few pages, and the gist was grasped. But to be quite fair, I should also mention that at times Parajanov was quite a hooligan. He was living the life of a character from some adventure movie. Marta Dzюba, the wife of Ivan Dzюba, had a memory of a time when they were in Tbilisi with Parajanov. They were at a market, Sergei was speaking with some merchant, and then Marta noticed how Sergei snitched a few vegetables which went completely unnoticed by the merchant. On their way home, Marta asked him what would have happened if the man had noticed, to which Parajanov replied, "Do not worry, it is an Eastern market. If you don't deceive, you get deceived. It is easy and not interesting to steal here, but when we come to Kiev and go to the Bessarabsky market, I will be stealing a chicken, and that will be interesting." This is a rather sketchy and fragmentary account of who Parajanov was, but it does tell us quite a lot about his elegant yet chaotic way of life, and his lifestyle in turn tells us quite a lot about his work, about which I'm going to speak in a bit more detail. The first thing that we should understand before getting to know Parajanov's cinema is the overall state of cinema in the Soviet Union. The most important thing about it is that in 1932 the Communist Party decided to introduce state regulations into Soviet art, thus introducing the only preferable, but in fact the only allowed, artistic style in the whole Union, socialist realism. According to this style, art, literature and cinema should always have a political intention of shaping the society by showing what ideal life in the country should look like. The thing about socialist realism was that it was meant to be popular art, that is, art understandable by the common folk, most notably the proletariat. Because of that, art had to be limited in its expressive means in order to make itself understandable. The narrative had to be straightforward, the narrative had to exist, the artistic reality had to be understandable, easy to interpret, etc. In fact, the first films by Parajanov did to a large degree adhere to the rules of socialist realism, and Parajanov himself would later renounce those first movies because of their low artistic quality. Although it's also not that low, and there are some nice decisions in those movies. It all changed with his movie The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, his first major success, which was also acclaimed very highly by the critics both from the Soviet Union and abroad. This film is set in Ukraine, in the Carpathian Mountains and in the ethnic region of Gutsulshchina. It's based on a novella of the same name by Mikhailo Kozybinsky, one of the most important Ukrainian writers of the beginning of the 20th century, known for developing the style of Impressionism in Ukrainian literature. The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors is a story that, at its core, tells us about an unfulfilled love between two young people, kind of like Romeo and Juliet, but at the same time quite different from it, with its rich use of Ukrainian folklore. However, both the novella and the film by Parajanov are not so much about the story or about what is told on the pages or on screen. They are more about how the story is told, about things that are not actually told because they're not part of the narrative. Now, I'll leave out of this video the innovations that Kozybinsky introduced in his novella that deserves a separate video, and rather speak more about the innovations by Parajanov. Now, the first thing that sets this later Parajanov apart from many other Soviet directors is that his movies, including The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, are very politically undefined. They don't seem to make any political statement or advocate for the communist cause. Nothing like that. So even though the Soviet critics were trying to interpret this movie and this story as an example of class struggle, it goes much further than ideology can reach. This is actually one of the things that perhaps make Parajanov a very universal artist. Even when he shoots a film about a very particular part of a very particular country, he still manages to make a statement to the whole of humanity, because in his work the aesthetical component is much more important than the political one. Parajanov himself was writing about that the following: "We discovered the Carpathians not as some kind of ethnographic material for ourselves. Love, despair, loneliness, death, these are the frescoes from the human life that we were trying to create. I was not surprised that this film, based on very particular material, was very well understood abroad by the Spanish, the French, in Latin America." However, what should also be mentioned is that Parajanov's movie, although being rather apolitical, was indeed perceived as quite political at his time. There were a few reasons. First, the movie was shot exclusively in Ukrainian and used a very specific dialect of Ukrainian from the western regions of the country, which was not quite acceptable by the Soviet officials, who wanted to unify the linguistic situation in the republics and even propagate the use of Russian in all of them. Then another problem the film created for the authorities was that it was actually never dubbed into Russian and instead went to be released in the original with subtitles, a case that was extremely rare for the Soviet cinema, which almost always dubbed films into Russian. And then this film, along with the figure of Parajanov, were like a magnet for Ukrainian opposition. In 1965, for example, on the premiere of the film in Kiev, there occurred one of the most important protests in Ukraine against the Soviet rule. And this was one of the reasons why Parajanov was eventually imprisoned and wasted 5 years in exile. So I must apologize and make a bit of a correction about the beginning of the video, where I mistakenly called Parajanov a Soviet director, which he was, at most, according to his passport and Wikipedia. So coming back to cinematography, another important feature of Parajanov's cinema, and The Shadows in particular, is its deeply rooted use of folklore. In this case, folklore is not some kind of decoration for the whole, which is the reason why I earlier said that it's quite different from Romeo and Juliet, though being similar in terms of the story. Folklore and ethnography are not meant to decorate the plot similar to that of Romeo and Juliet. Folklore and ethnography are themselves part of what this movie is about and how it's made. One example is the constant use of the sound of the trombita, which is the traditional Ukrainian instrument in the movie. The sound of the trombita here serves a structural function. In the movie it becomes a harbinger of death, and every time that you hear it, we also know that someone has died. Another example of experimental use of folklore is seen in the use of the camera. One recurring technique is the use of the spinning camera, where the camera follows the character who goes in circles. As such, this can be seen as a reference to the rhythm of a ritual, where the camera itself starts to dance along with the characters. This leads us to another feature of Parajanov's cinematography. It is in fact closer to poetry than it is to prose. Parajanov notably disregards any kind of clear narrative, and as a matter of fact, any kind of narrative at all, in favor of other things that are harder to grasp and tie together. For one thing, his works abound in visual metaphors. When he wishes to express something, he seldom does that in a straightforward way, and instead uses metaphors. One example is the scene where Marichka, one of the main characters, is about to die in a river. In that scene, Marichka is trying to save a black sheep, but instead slips on a rock and falls down into the river. I highly doubt that what Parajanov meant was that Marichka died of carelessness, for it's not a didactic movie for kids. What he instead refers to is alienation and loneliness, which are metaphorically represented by the black sheep. So it seems that in this case Parajanov tries to say that Marichka died because of how alienated she was and because of how strongly the society rejected her. Another poetic feature that is present in Parajanov's work is musicality. Parajanov often uses rhythm and visual rhymes inside of his movies. I've already given one example of the usage of musical instruments that structure the film, but there's also numerous cases when Parajanov rhymes certain scenes and makes them kind of talk to each other. One example is a shot where Ivan, another main character, prepares for his wedding and is getting bathed in some kind of house. Another shot much later in the movie, when Ivan is already dead, has an identical camera setup and almost identical composition, which kind of reflects that his marriage with Palahna, a woman he didn't love, was already a kind of death for him. Like poetry, Parajanov's movies are also notoriously difficult to interpret in one single way. Their meaning is kind of ineffable. Parajanov himself was very much conscious about it. Vasily Katañan, a Soviet director, has a story where he was reading the following passage of Michelangelo Antonioni to Parajanov. When I was doing The Cry, that excellent actress Betsy Blair wanted to go over the script with me, and she would ask me for an explanation of every line. Those 2 hours I spent with her going over the script were the most hellish hours of my life, since I was forced to invent meanings that weren't there at all. After hearing this, Parajanov asked, "Could you repeat who said that?" It was Antonioni. "No, it was me." Another feature of Parajanov's cinema that is similar but at the same time different from poetry is how he uses an associative way of suggesting something using purely cinematic techniques. In particular, this has to do with the usage of the camera and editing. In one early shot, the young Ivan hangs out with Marichka and they wander off from the funeral procession they were supposed to be part of. But then the sound of trombitas, another indication of death, startles him. The camera swish pans to the left, showing the banners of the procession as if they were very close to Ivan and Marichka. But then in the next shot we see how Ivan actually is quite far from the procession, much further than the previous shot has suggested. One way to interpret this is that falling in love and being with your beloved takes the person outside of normal existence and outside of societal norms, but Ivan never realizes how much he is distanced from the society until the moment he runs away from his beloved. All of these features that we may consider poetical actually had a great influence on all subsequent world cinema, and especially Ukrainian cinema, giving rise to the so-called Ukrainian Poetic Cinema movement. At the same time, The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors is in no way a merit of Parajanov only. Many other people greatly contributed to the movie, notably the artist Georgy Akutovich, whose engravings inspired many of the shots in the movie, and the camera operator Yuri Ilenko, who is actually responsible for many great decisions that have to do with the camera work. Ilenko's involvement in the production of the film was so strong that it even sparked a conflict with Parajanov himself. As Parajanov was telling in one of his memoirs, the conflict was so bad that they decided to go on a duel where they would shoot at each other with pistols on a bridge. But it happened so that the river was so overflooded that it destroyed the bridge and the duel never happened, so they continued to work together. The story shows that although The Shadows is indeed one of Parajanov's most important and beautiful films, it is so to a great extent because of other people's contribution to it. His later movies, on the other hand, although still retaining most of the features I've spoken about, have a more independent character, because in them Parajanov polished his own signature style to perfection. So, on the one hand, the later movies still have that same poeticality and associative narration. One example is the movie The Color of Pomegranate, which is based on the life of the Transcaucasian poet Sergei. But the film never shows the development and growth of the character directly. Instead, it uses very rich metaphorics for that, like in the case of this shot where the young poet has the pose of an embryo, which suggests that this is the point when he is conceived and born. Another example is this shot where one younger character is passing an kamancha, a traditional instrument of the land, to another older character. This signifies the growth of the poet, the fact that he has now stepped onto a new stage of his life. However, these films also develop a new kind of style that was only partly present in The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. The first thing that catches your attention when watching them is the movement of the camera, its absence to be more exact. Parajanov's movies, starting with Kiev frescoes, are built mainly as a series of static shots, which are sometimes called tableau. In view of this, the use of the word fresco in Parajanov's unfinished movie is not accidental, because a fresco is what his movies try to be, a kind of static visual medium with many things that are drawn on it. Parajanov himself was saying this in relation to the pictorial nature of his films. I have always been fond of painting as an art, and for a long time I've been used to the fact that I perceive the shot as an independent pictorial canvas. I know that my films willingly dissolve into painting, and this is probably their first weakness and first strength. In my practice, I most often turn to a pictorial solution instead of a literary one, and the literature that is most accessible to me is that which is essentially itself a transformed painting. This is what Kotzubinski's story seemed to me. This static nature of shots has to do with what smart people call intermediality, that is, the mixing of different media inside a work of art. So in the case of Parajanov's movies, they often draw inspiration from illustrations and paintings and engravings. This could actually be seen already in The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, which is partly based on the engravings by Georgi Yakutovich, but goes even further in Parajanov's next movies. For example, in The Color of Pomegranates, Sayat-Nova and his beloved Anna are both played by the same actor Sofiko Chaureli, which may be a reference to Persian miniatures that had a great influence over the art of Armenia, and also frequently used the same face for both a woman and a man. This illustrative and pictorial nature of Parajanov's movies also have great influence over how narration and storytelling works in his movies. Yuri Lotman, an Estonian scholar, once noted that Parajanov's movies have a sort of unique way of narrating things. While there is indeed a conventional narrative from the beginning of the movies to their end, some kind of core story, they also within each of their still shots have a narrative of their own, which is at times quite independent from the core narrative of the movie. Let's take as an example this shot from the movie The Legend of Suram Fortress. In this scene there is a great many details that create their own micro-narrative, suggesting that there is a kind of story behind them. There's women dancing on the roof, there's a man juggling before a crowd, there's women that seem to be cooking some food, there's people who launch doves into the sky, and there's a man who watches the doves fly. Some of this suggests that perhaps there is some kind of celebration happening in the fortress, but we don't know what kind of celebration it is, so we can only guess. But then we also see a funeral procession going across the yard, thus bringing some kind of sorrow into the joyful environment of the fortress. The funeral procession itself is also a kind of metaphor. It combines with the previous shot of the Suram fortress getting destroyed, so the funeral that we see is of nothing else than the fortress itself. So in this way, Parajanov mixes some kind of independent story or stories that exist only inside the shot itself with the overall story of the fall of the Suram fortress. So in a way we can say that Parajanov's shots exist both in time as part of narration and outside of time as separate works of art that fall out of narration. This means that even though Parajanov's movies should be watched from beginning to end, they may also be very easily watched as separate images, shots, frescoes, and miniatures. Another important feature of Parajanov's movies that has to do with intermediality is that when he draws inspiration from other media such as painting, illustration, or miniature, he also tries to reflect upon the medium itself and perhaps even completely rethink it. Let's have a look at this short film A Cop of Natanian, which is a documentary about one of the most important Armenian portrait artists. In it, Parajanov makes a very interesting narrative decision. He doesn't show the portraits by Natanian in their wholeness, but instead in parts, which actually defies human perception itself. Let me explain. When we find a painting somewhere in a gallery or open it on a computer screen, we see it whole. We at once grasp what in general happens on the painting, its genre, its general style, etc. And only after that do we go to investigate its details, how exactly it's made. We start to split the painting into parts. This is actually what we tend to call by the word analysis, that is the process of breaking a complex object up in order to better understand it. Parajanov, on the other hand, goes into a completely different direction. Instead of showing us the whole, he shows only the parts, making us wonder, what is this fragment part of? What other parts are there? How do they combine? This, contrary to the more natural analytical approach, is something that we call by the word synthesis, that is the process of combining parts to make a whole. So it seems that in this short movie, Parajanov tries to defy human perception itself and make it go into the opposite direction. Another example of how Parajanov tries to reflect on the nature of cinema is in the beginning of The Color of Pomegranates, where there are two subsequent shots. One shows 3 pomegranates with red liquid spreading on the cloth beneath them. Another shows a dagger with the same kind of red liquid spreading on the cloth beneath it. This makes us wonder, does the meaning of the red liquid change from one shot to the other, given that it's visually the same kind of liquid? It turns out it does, as in the first shot we are more likely to take the liquid to be the juice of the pomegranates and associate it with life and some kind of vitality, whereas in the second shot the red liquid is more likely to be interpreted as blood, a symbol for suffering that is present throughout the whole movie. So in this case, Parajanov makes an implicit statement about how signs work and how context influences the interpretation of the signs in cinema. To conclude, at the same time as Parajanov's movies display to you some kind of scene which has a meaning of its own and contributes to unfolding the overall narrative, they also tend to, at the same time, reflect upon themselves and upon cinema as a medium. And this, along with musicality, use of folklore, visual rhymes, cinematic rhythm, and associative narrative, make Parajanov one of the most experimental and important cinema directors in the world. Most of his movies were essentially about people who wished to be eternally free, free from pettiness and everyday life, free to fly into space at any time, like a character of a poem by Walt Whitman. He was saying about the shadows of forgotten ancestors that we wanted to make a film about a free man, about a heart that wanted to break out and break free from the everyday, from the petty passions and habits, wanted to rid his body and soul of them, about a poet who once lost his muse and is now doomed to a life which he does not understand and where he is not understood either. Undoubtedly, Parajanov was living his life as though he himself was a character of his own movie, trying to become a poet or learning to fly. And in the end, he did succeed, and he was sure about it. Once when he was traveling on a rather dangerous road in the mountains, he asked his companions, "Aren't you afraid? For I have already made myself immortal."